So every fall, just before school starts, like the couple days before orientation, basically, it's primarily faculty. It's called the academic retreat, but really it's a faculty retreat. And it's an off-site event in which there's the agenda committee for the faculty, as well as certain maybe key governance groups for the year. Kind of lay out issues, invite faculty to share concerns. People work on curriculum planning initiatives. This year, because there were two really big groups at work, the Standing Committee on the Curriculum, and then the President's new Equity Council was just founded. Those two groups were invited by the Agenda Committee to kind of open the event. And so they were like, do you want to come and share some data? And I'm like, well, no. Here's what I want to do. Because if I share data, it becomes a back and forth, like, with me. And what I wanted to do, what I said I would do, is create a workshop. So I will bring some data and ask people to engage with it from whatever lens they choose to. Because the goal at that retreat was to get faculty engaged in some of the key issues facing the college: enrollment decline, retention challenges. Obviously, the Equity Council wanted to get them in tune with equity gaps, and the curriculum committee wanted to get folks thinking about how are we planning more strategically a curriculum with more transparent pathways for students. So basically, the retreat was just to kind of introduce those ideas. We had about an hour and a half total in the morning for all those groups to present and for there to be some workshops on the data. And as I circulated around the room, I saw people flipping to a part of it that really interested them. Like, so obviously some small groups went directly to the back of the packet and wanted to jump into, like, what are students naming as their areas of focus, and how does that match with the faculty distribution that we have? And they were really engrossed in those. Other folks responded more to issues around, if students are learning things that supposedly are the very things that employers want, then why are students also telling us they're not sure their education is relevant? So there's puzzles that we have, right? So sure, employers on these big national surveys say that they want things like communication skills, critical thinking, problem solving, being able to get along with all kinds of people, you know, on teams and committees and whatnot. And yet, when we ask students, do you think your education that you're able to build is helping prepare you, you know, for your goal and your life? And they're like, no, I'm less confident that I'm here. And so we saw some people really engaging in that and saying, what is my role as a faculty member? What power do I have in my program to help students name their learning, or to help be more transparent, or to actually critique my own curriculum and say, maybe I'm doing okay with content, but not with technical skills. I'm only framing this to say that they're very different audience and purpose, right? I was really inviting people to say, what speaks to you? Pick any page here and find something that inspires you to kind of critically reflect on your practice. Whereas the heat map, different document, after 10 years of very intentionally trying not to do this work, I eventually ran out of choices and was pretty much demanded to do this. And so it's part of what's a big thing called the scorecard movement across the country. And I think it oversimplifies things a lot. I think it can also make very small, especially when you're slicing things so finely as every single group disaggregated, you also end up with a chance of data that bounces a ton, right? It's not using most scorecards around the country, including the leaders of this movement. They're not doing things like weighted averages for small samples. And so you could say something's low one year, and by the next year, because 2 more students were retained, it's suddenly high. Dealing with populations that are tiny in some cases. Oh, and in the case of like the alumni survey, national survey of student engagement, or in-house surveys, in this office, we actually pooled 2 years of the same questions to get the N high enough to analyze. And then we're not going to present back out differences that look different unless they test to be statistically significant. And the reason is because it's so likely that you could find a random fluctuation. But even to get to those, we had to pool 2 years worth of data, 2 years worth of alumni surveys. And yet I like it as a method more because you're reducing the noise, right? You're saying, let's hone in on things that seem to be true over time. They are true. They are significantly different. They're not just a little bit different, and it might just adjust again next year or next quarter. And kind of we have fewer issues to then to consider, if you will, like focus the discussion. Because these heat maps that like every issue is equally important and all this stuff, and really I'm looking at them from the data perspective going, some of this stuff could shift next week. Like, because I know how these yield rates work, and I know how it's increasing for this group. Well, enrollment's down across the campus. my bigger concern as a data person is how are we going to get enrollment up? Who's our market? Who are we reaching? Where are yield rates low? If we talk to students who were offered admission and they say, I chose to go somewhere else or chose not to go to college, how do we unpack how to meet those students' needs, right? And the other, in addition to the scorecard movement, this big data thing that's going on across the country, overly disaggregating, I think. And it becomes very problem-based. People only want to talk about where the problems are. And there are a lot of places, even if you flip a few pages into the heat map and you find some of the statistical analysis, there are pages where we could learn something from the strengths. And it is so incredibly hard to get those 22 people on that council to think about what can we learn from the fact that Latinx students are the best retained. What could we learn from that? And we have evidence of what's going on. They actually are more socially integrated. They're saying my social experiences are better, my academic experiences are better, and I feel better able to that I have the right level of challenge in my courses. So if we take those factors and we say, we think these are, because they are also significantly different for Latinx students compared to non-Latin students, what if these are some of the things that are contributing to their satisfaction retention? What if we worked on those elements for other types of students, other subgroups, but also just students in general? And it's really interesting because the equity gap movement that the scorecard thing led to was such a deficit focus, right? It's like who's not thriving became the crisis. And just so you understand a little bit more about the context, it's called the Equity and Inclusion Council. I think it's had 3 different names. I've been a part of this and a prior committee for 6 years and another DTF for 2 years before that. So I've been through a lot of iterations. And the groups will say, we're looking at multiple dimensions of diversity, right? We're looking at not just race, we're looking at ableism, we're looking at gender, we're looking at veteran status. We care about first-generation students and low socioeconomic level, right? So they'll say a lot of things that apply to a lot more of our students, right? The dialogue always becomes foregrounded by race. It just goes there. I mean, I've been just like, and you're like, well, so this group is lower than the other group, and I'm like, actually, veterans are lower than that, you know, or men are struggling more, you know. But it's also really tricky anytime you have a room full of folks that are often recruited to these committees intentionally because of a particular agenda or a particular, let's say, particular expertise, maybe is a less politically charged word, but both I think are in play. And so one of the things I liked about being able to do the academic retreat piece is that I allowed people to engage with what struck them as important, right? So individual groups could say, this is troubling to me, that I look at this and I see issues for first generation students, and that matters a lot to me. And that way it didn't matter whether or not I could get 22 people in the Equity Council to focus on that as a priority, because I could show people the data that says, actually, we have pretty serious issues here. And so that's my foregrounding on what the 2 sources are. Obviously, there's even more studies. There's a non-retained study. There's all the enrollment trends on our fact page. There's one of these pieces has so much analysis behind it. So not all of it is present on that Equity Council page, but at least these 2 big ones are. Last year, on a different committee, they wanted to hire somebody for $250,000 out of USC who's the expert on heat maps, and ultimately the person just comes in and helps you interpret it. All of the work would have still had to be done by my office to disaggregate everything. And, I mean, the nuances they had things like progress in the major, and I'm like, folks, how are we going to do that? Like, you know, I mean, there's just some realities to what are we going to look at. Each one of those would be its own puzzle. But luckily, we saved the college about $250,000 wasted dollars, and this was like my consolation prize for them, if you will. Like I was like, okay, I will go this far in your desire. But yeah, they hired an outside consultant to come in and tell us to do this. It's not the only data source. Do you know what I mean? It's not the only way of looking, and I know that it gets treated that way a little bit in the council plan. It's like, oh well, there's data, so we can make these claims. Even the fact that they, first of all, ignored the fact that Native American students were actually overperforming in others. There are curricular implications here that are more interesting to me. The students are not evenly distributed across our curriculum, and opportunities for things like internship, capstone study, community service, for example, those are not evenly distributed in the curriculum. So some of what we're picking up in that is where do these students choose to do their work? And so some of what we pick up in this is It's just analysis to begin with. And then the question of the sort of what is underneath it, what's the cause, and is it actually a problem? But all of those to me are extra questions. If Native American students are, let's say they were let me go to that page. If Native American students said, I've been trying to do an internship for 6 years and no one will sponsor me, that's an issue. But if the reason that that is low is because the part of the curriculum they're in doesn't have very many internships in general, maybe it's not part of the culture of that discipline, maybe something else is, maybe installation art is part of that discipline. Like there's other ways to do capstones. And so, I mean, I think that there's a way in which when I'm presenting an individual study and we can engage with it, it's different than when people with a plan and a charge want to focus only on the gaps. They're going to handpick out some of those gaps, right? The scorecard is not looking at interaction of factors. It's looking at each one as if it's a yes/no. I don't think those recommendations very well match the data in some cases. And having been a part of the process, I will tell you that a lot of times the recommendations walked in the room from the very first kickoff meeting, and that then it became the burden of the data to try to for people to find some data to support what they believed. One of the examples was students of colors have poor retention. It walked in the room with people who walked in that room, and I said, that is a false statement. I don't know how many times I said that is a false statement. We have certain groups of students lagging behind other groups. The more robust weighted year average, which helps to control for small samples when you're comparing them to bigger samples, shows that we will continue to lag even if we have a couple of years, but these have been pervasive over time. SAT analysis is part of that analysis, and it shows that the SAT scores for some of those groups that are lagging are significantly lower at entry. We admit 98% of our students. We do not then ever give any form of assessment or reaching up of that student's skill level with a good placement in our curriculum, right? We can say, oh, welcome, but then fend for yourself. There are institutional questions about that sort of thing, but I will tell you that the weighted average analysis it helps to control for some of that noise. That is none of that mattered to the folks who walked in that room saying students of color are less well retained. I'm like, actually, they've been within about a percentage as a group, right? Now they're talking about pooling all people of color together, right? As a group, they've been within about 1 percentage point of the retention of white non-Hispanic students for years here. There's hardly any gap, right? But people like to say it. They were attached to it. There were people who were attached to saying that even when I showed them data that said that's not the case. And that to me is a huge danger of the sort of the oversimplification of the heat map. And then the other issue is keeping the data that is more robust that shows that it's a 1% gap, right? Because I put the whole retention chart in the academic retreat packet. See, it's like, let's say it's 82 and 81% or something like that. You're like, it's lower, which is really the same. Like it's within a percentage point, right? And so when you choose to then make a statement by a bullet, but it doesn't have anything behind it, there's data behind it, but the data is so far away from it, like it's physically located, like there's no number in the bullet statement of the report. They're not saying in 1%, we should keep an eye on this. And part of it was some things that we know that we needed a queer and trans center here 30 years ago. Like I actually don't argue that point. We needed a queer and trans center here for students 30 years ago and 10 years ago and 5 years ago. And I've had a really hard time arguing that case. It doesn't, but then to try to force data to make that case for you is part of the frustration that I was having. I'm super happy that we have a new student support center here. And to me, one of the biggest cases I've got is the massive growth in the number of students who identify that way. Every other subgroup on this campus, we've got a group that's a historically underrepresented group we have a group for, right? And there were no staff advocates, which means all advocacy was happening from the students themselves. That is a huge burden with no other staff dedicated. If you're a first generation student, if you have a disability, if you're a person of color, if you're multicultural, if you're an international student, if you, I'm trying to think of what else, if you're first generation, if you're low income, we have dedicated and specific programs, student activities, support structures, and staff, people who actually it's their job. And there weren't any. And so I would have argued it on that ground. But I think that ultimately they grabbed that retention argument because it's the only one that they had from the heat map. And people wanted to say we needed a center. So another key movement, it's not always just race-based retention and our failures as an institution rooted in historical racism that says that, which all of that is true. I don't mean to shrug that off. But that's not the only agenda that walks in. Another one is that there is still an ongoing conflict about what affirmative action means. And the problem is because people will come in and say, we need to hire more X. And you're like, actually, no, that was not accidental. We brought in experts, we brought in policy, because they're definitely, and it continues to play out. People can't quite let go of the notion. They don't want to be governed by that rule. Well, Evergreen should be different. I'm like, and jeopardize all future federal funding. Is that really how far you want to go here? Now, because of the mission of this institution and the goals that we have and the wide array of students that we serve, we do hope that our faculty and staff engage in ongoing professional development to continue to work on their cultural competency. And that would be things like understanding what real ADA accommodation means. It means exploring why might first-generation students be having some different kinds of experiences or anxieties about their jobs and futures when they're taking on loan debt. Big deal, big question. And I think that I know myself and I know most people have more to keep learning because the world changes. You got to keep learning, and that we hope is happening. But that's professional development. It's not like who you hire. It's making sure that you're committed to continually improving how you serve your students and thinking about new nuances, right? Gender non-binary students is huge here now. And even a decade ago, it was such a small population and awareness was less that I would say it was much less intentional. And now it's like the faculty are like, dang, we have a learning curve. I need to know a lot more about pronoun usage and introductions and online learning platforms so I don't inadvertently out students, and things like that. So I think we can agree on that. When it came to the hiring, though, there are people who are like, we should be representational. We should be hiring intentionally, for example, Latino people because we have more Latino students, and it's illegal. So there's a row in the heat map called affirmative action labor force. That is about our staff and faculty labor force, and it's analyzed by a group that we contract with for our formal federal affirmative action reporting. And it's not a simple question about which labor group is used. Okay, so each different job classification uses a different comparison group. There are 3 categories that we actually are holding ourselves accountable for: veteran status, disability, and race. And we can't hire to those, right? That's illegal. We can only monitor them or see if we have the kind of environment. You can do things like recruitment. You can recruit differently, advertise differently. You could create a better campus climate that was more welcoming, but you cannot make a hiring selection decision based on any of those criteria. Cannot. Illegal. So the affirmative action labor force has a ton more science behind it, and we're only seeing 2 things pop across the entire category, right? We are underrepresented in veterans and disabilities relative to the labor force from which we draw our positions, meaning what's going on? That what the labor force analysis says is there are people out there that you as an institution are not choosing. And it's to me, that it begs a different kind of a question, right? It's saying it was not the lack of veterans and persons with disabilities in your job categories. It was that they are either not applying to your college, they don't think they belong there, or you're screening them out, or you're not doing good recruitment. Like there's something else playing out that has more institutional, potentially institutional impact. Simple comparison, like let's say it was 45% male and we had 48% male students, for example. It'd be like, oh, well, you're 3% fewer in your staff than you are in your student body. It's that simple. It's just crazy low. It's not even weighted for 2 years. It's like I don't like it. It answers a question. I believe that overinterpretation is a danger. Certainly, it presents what it measured, which is what is there a difference in proportion relative to the students, right? But if that difference was 1 or 2%, would I think that was enough to make a big action on? No. And the reason is because, again, back to the affirmative action report, we've only had 1 full one, and we've just submitted our data for the second one. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot to draw on. But the other really cool thing they did is they figured out when there were differences, they said how many whole people would it take to actually move this metric. And the reason they did it in whole people is that if you're half a percentage under, you do 1 hire and you've actually exceeded your target. That report even took into context if you have a unit of IT professionals that only has 11 people in it, and you're slightly under in females relative to the labor force, And what they would tell us in the other column is one hire would push you over. And in other cases, they were like, you're under, and then they'd say, nothing. You don't need to do anything. You're less than a person away from hitting target. It's not an issue. And so I liked they put that kind of screening on it to say, like, what kind of N are we really talking about here? And that is, this composition data is pure proportions. It is not even weighted across 2 years. It's really challenging to weight across 2 years because so many of the staff and faculty would be the same people that I could end up double counting. So it's not easy. With the surveys, I know I've got two distinctly different groups of alumni, right? And so I'm not double counting the same individual in their experience. I'm just getting a bigger pool of men, women, veterans, first-gen students to work from. With faculty and staff, we've got mostly the same people, right? Our turnover is going to be, what, maybe 15% a year? So mostly if you're weighting those over a couple of years, it's tricky. I should figure out something, but go to National Survey of Student Engagement. We are floundering in terms of political diversity interactions on our campus, for example, whereas we have strength in racial diversity interactions, we are floundering in terms of political. And by floundering, I mean it was poor and it's now poorer. We have a parallel on the alumni survey in which we set, again, an accreditation goal, improving the tolerance for different or opposing viewpoints on campus. And in fact, over the 4-year period that we've been measuring it, and we just hit our last measurement year, we have declined in alumni satisfaction with tolerance for opposing or different viewpoints. Are they perfect indicators? Not necessarily, but they get at that we have a much narrower range of political diversity than we do other kinds of diversity. Just to even get a baseline, because I think that our indicators that tell us that we are struggling with our tolerance for different political views is already an indicator that we should probably know what's going on. Like, what is the slant of our current student body? Like, what's the skew? But also, you can mitigate for it. If you know that you have 85% hyper-liberals and you're teaching about veterinary care, so how are you going to help for educational reasons, right? And also, obviously, for the support of the few students that are over on the other end of the continuum. I want to support them too. But also, I think for the academic outcome, it makes no sense for us not to be challenged by an alternative perspective. The case, I think, rests in the fact that other indicators that we are struggling are already present. Like, there's a reason to want to unpack this a little more. I think there's even a data case to be like, okay, guys, not only is this a struggle for us, this is something we're actually getting worse at. Over the last 2 years, our scores all went down. And that means there are students here who are really not experiencing, I mean, both angles of what you're talking about. Diverse perspectives in the classroom is one of them, right? But the other is, are you finding your classrooms tolerant of something outside of or opposing viewpoints? Are you finding room for these to be expressed? And if both pieces are dropping, like, so that's both sort of the material that we're choosing to put in our programs, the sources, the information, the ideas, and the acceptance of those ideas, or should they be raised through a different source, the acceptance and tolerance of opposing views. I don't know if you dug in far enough to the academic retreat packet. Every single item in satisfaction was tested for these groups, right? Most cases, only 3 or 4 of them even pop as significantly different. And one of them that popped was Asian students significantly less satisfied with tolerance and acceptance of opposing views. And it was interesting how even if you say that and point to it and say it and point to it, the people are like, yeah. Let's get back to this other issue. And again, I'm not saying it's because folks are Asian. I'm not trying to imply that. But I'm like, this is a puzzling finding. And it makes me wonder, one, what part of the curriculum are these students in? What is going on? And what are the viewpoints that they're experiencing that are not being accepted? We are so much lower than other liberal arts colleges on that political one. The few students who are saying they're having those interactions are the students who are obviously already the minority. And the reason I believe I can say that is the same thing happened with the race question. Like, students of color, like, let's say it's a really small group, like Pacific Islander, they are much more likely to say that they're having very regular interactions with people of a different race. All they had to do was go to a seminar and they're like, yeah, this happens every day for me. But still, those things end up being much more frequent the smaller the membership group you're a part of. If I am a super conservative student at Evergreen, every political conversation I have is going to be across difference, right? But your point is well taken, and being able to unpack it is interesting. It was also interesting how quickly that data gets dismissed by some audiences. I mean, not by everyone, but some students were like, oh, Asian students are less satisfied. And then they'd be like, but it's Black students who are having a hard time in seminar. I'm like, did you see this data? It is not Black students. It is first-generation students. The vast majority of first-generation students at Evergreen are white. The vast majority. There are in-state, lower-income white residents. That's actually most of them. I'm not exclusively. Yes, we have first-generation students of color. Yes, we have out-of-state first-gen students. But I mean, that the first-gen population is really heavily dominated by in-state white resident students, like from Washington, for whom we're the cheapest public college, and it's often local. And the real puzzle there is like, when I look at the goals for college, they're like, I definitely want to have a better socioeconomic options in my future. I want to be able to get a job of my choice. My whole family's behind me in this. Like, it's not even that they're out on their own. A lot of families put a lot of stock in sending that first generation to school, and then we run our other risks of like, does our curriculum actually support you in the kind of goals you want? And do we kind of honor our promises or set you up and then suddenly stop offering that program? Bigger equity questions for me have to do with that right now, as far as like where my heart of this work is. But boy, it's taking a lot of time, I'll tell you. People want to do something, right? They want to take action. They want to do something. But to also have permission to critique, like there's a lot of rigidity around the engagement with this, not just the document, but with the initiatives. Seems like there's a fear of critique. There's a party line in the committee. Like, questioning the plan was met with you're on board. I mean, even within the group, there should be room for us to say, look, we're all committed to this. The fact that we have slightly different perspectives on how to move forward shouldn't be a threat, right? It could be a strength. There's such a fear in saying that we're doing well at some things. In some cases, our gaps are so much smaller than the national norms, and no one even wants to talk about it. Guys, we have the National Student Retention Data Exchange data that says we may be disappointed in ourselves that African American and Native American students are not persisting as well towards graduation. But do you know how big that gap is in other schools? It's blasphemy to say such a thing. And yet there's often another context. And in one context, the fact that 80% of the graduates that we have every year meet one of those criteria or another, 80% of our graduates. And actually it's up to 84% last year, to be honest. It's climbing, partially due to the growth in first generation low-income students, actually. But I mean, low-income students, non-traditional age, veteran, disability, or a person of color, if we look at the possibility of any of those criteria, it's the vast majority of students who are completing college degrees here. We are doing something to counter historical norms. But that in and of itself is taboo right now in the climate that we're in. We are underrepresented on this campus relative to our surrounding environs in terms of, we're under in terms of Latino and Asian. We're way over in terms of Native and Black. And in fact, we have a lot more than this area of Washington. Like, if you look at our region, Evergreen's student body is already diversifying the region in which it exists. Like, we are drawing students from other urban populations, from California, from other places. That it's fascinating to me. Like, we're very overrepresented. And the other thing about representational equity in faculty and staff, like, first of all, it frustrates me. It should be something you explore, not something you govern for. So there's a dominant culture regardless, right? Regardless of the actual ends that you might discover underneath it, like what's going on, like the actual distribution, there's still a dominant political correct culture, if you will. Why would you be like, well, I voted for Trump? Like, would I say that in a room full of people? And even if I had an interesting rationale about healthcare or about, it's not about him, it's about what I think for the pendulum to swing, because there are people who think it's time to force the question. I've heard different things, but you have to talk to people very individually. You're not going to see any of that on the big forum announcements and stuff. You got to find people who are courageous enough to just want to tell you what's on their mind, and it's usually on a one-on-one basis. Even if there is more political diversity here than we even presume, there's a normative. It's why it's okay to say, well, that person's clearly that fit. They used to work for the Department of Defense. The fact that we would believe that was okay to say in a room tells me there's a dominant culture. But having a multi-institutional study helps those who feel most vulnerable and who have something to say. Believe me, they will have something to say, especially if it's in an anonymous way. You want a response rate from not just the choir members, if you will. You say you're always preaching in the choir or something. You want it from some of those naysayers and the folks who are most nervous. If I feel like I'm being kind of it's a possibility that I can still get my responses heard, but also have them hidden in this like larger study, which includes some other institutions, then I feel less vulnerable.